England and 6 other soccer teams dropped plans to wear anti-discrimination armbands at the Qatar World Cup after FIFA threatened them with sanctions. FIFA notified 7 European teams that players would be subject to sporting sanctions, including automatic yellow cards for wearing One Love armbands. The target of the anti-discrimination message was understood to be anti-homosexuality laws in Qatar, the Wall Street Journal reports.
MSNBC's Ayman Mouladeen commented on criticisms of Qatar hosting the World Cup and double standards of the U.S. Let's watch.
While it's fair to question and criticize Qatar, I wonder if this debate is truly about migrant workers' rights and human rights, or is it that European countries who view themselves as the guardians of global soccer for their own selfish economic purposes can't stomach the idea that an Arab Middle Eastern country will host this venerable global gathering? I wonder if any of these American pundits grandstanding about human rights will call for the U.S. to be stripped of hosting the 2026 World Cup for the way elected leaders in this country and our judicial system in this country have rolled back reproductive rights, or are trying to ban the word gay in public schools, or even ban books.
I think that's some transparently absurd whataboutism, but this sounds like a terrible idea to have hosted the World Cup in this country. Look, if you want to say there should not be political messages just in general on people's armbands because sports should try to be politically neutral, I guess that would be fine. This seems actually that this is clearly specifically targeted to appeasing this country's anti-homosexuality laws, but they should not have gotten themselves into this situation by having the World Cup there, is what I would say. They also banned beer for people for fans attending. Did you hear that?
Is alcohol ordinarily allowed in the country?
No.
Okay, so that's consistent with the rules of the country.
But they're allowing it in certain special box, like people who paid extra or something, like the very elite people are going to have it. It just seems bad.
I want to go back to this question of it being whataboutism. I don't know that I agree. I'm trying to work through this because, look, we talk all the time when we criticize the justifications for U.S. imperialism, something that we agree about how we cherry pick human rights abuses, genuine instances of humanitarian need as being cravenly lifted up by the U.S. as a justification for our involvement. We talked about the women and children being exploited as a reason to invade Afghanistan. There was the Gulf War being justified on this idea of babies being thrown out of ventilators. We know this to be the case. And that's not, some of those are lies, but some of it are legitimate. Some of it is legitimate bad things happening in other parts of the world.
Right. It is true that fewer women learn how to read under Taliban control or whatever it is.
And it does seem similarly like a kind of a cherry picking of wrongdoing. Again, genuine political stances and kind of a political leadership that I would disagree with, obviously, on the merits, but in a way that might be calculated to justify American hegemony and American superiority, that it is actually helping the well-being of the people, of the folks in this country. And when you look at how America moves through the world, you heard, obviously Joe Biden saying he was going to make Saudi Arabia a pariah, and then justifying shielding MBS for an investigation over the death of Jamal Khashoggi. And when you see all these inconsistencies about how there was a recent interview this past week with Jon Stewart, Condoleezza Rice, and Hillary Clinton, where they are still talking about weapons of mass destruction and how America is so different than the rest of the world, and we have to intervene as America's policemen.
What were they saying about weapons of mass destruction?
That they were mistaken, and we should all consider it to be a mulligan. That kind of a line.
Are bad.
When you see rhetoric like that, I don't think that's entirely dissimilar from some people in the West who are taking this opportunity, having agreed to participate in this event, to grandstand their own moral superiority when I'm not sure that America can claim that ethical superiority when you look at how it's been behaving around the world.
No, yeah. I don't think, while I am a massive critic of a lot of the foreign policy decisions the U.S. makes, as are you, I think morally it is fine to grandstand over a nation like Qatar. I don't think it's necessarily important to signal or virtue signal on some kind of social issue that they have a difference with us on. Which is not to say that, I mean, their views are, I think, are wrong, but I understand why people get upset at within the U.S. context, right? All businesses say we're not going to do business in Georgia or Indiana or wherever because of some religious freedom law. But then they don't. But if Qatar doesn't want you to wear armbands, rainbow armbands, okay, yeah, we're not going to stand up to them. It's only ever standing up to bigoted conservative Christian Republicans here, never standing up to a much worse version of religious extremism.
I think on the individual basis, I mean, people were talking about a particular journalist who is gay and who, was wanting to wear the armband, had at one point, was pressured into not wearing it. On an individual basis, I completely understand why people want to take their stands, and I have no feelings about their willingness and ability to do so. I do think that there's a media aspect of this, though, that is invested in the idea of kind of heroic Westerners standing up to the government of Qatar, the people of Qatar, in a way that doesn't seem, that it seemed itself cherry-picked. So, for example, one could not go. Yeah. One could choose not to go. One could choose not to participate. Teams could choose to boycott. None of that is happening. I guess some of that is happening, but people instead are choosing to go and then grandstand. So to me, it feels akin to one could argue that it's akin to visiting the Vatican and not wanting to follow the rules about covering your arms and legs while you're there. It's perfectly fine to disagree with the Catholic Church, to criticize the Catholic Church, and to not also want to go and look at the Sistine Chapel. But if you want the benefit of going and seeing some artistic masterpiece or looking at it from a historical perspective, to go there and then loudly complain about the fact that it's hot and you don't want to wear a shawl seems to be...
Does the NFL have, or the NHL or baseball, basketball, et cetera, have rules against players kneeling during the anthem? Isn't this kind of like that?
Well, I think that if they have those rules, then players have the right to object and to boycott and to end the league. Mm-hmm. But that's the question here is whether or not people are trying to have it both ways. Going and participating in this event, playing in a country that did not just invent these rules overnight, that they know has a kind of a humanitarian standards that are not the same as what you would expect in the land.
Bad.
And at the same time, I think
not the same, but bad.
Well, from my perspective, they are. I also think that, I'm sorry, it's not both. With 2 million people in jail and the largest incarcerated population in the world, despite only having a much smaller fraction of the world's population, I think that it is extremely narrow-minded, short-sighted to sit here and judge other people's countries and not have that same expectation, the same judgment as the news commentator there said about what is America going to say that we don't deserve to hold an upcoming Olympic Games or whatever a kind of national event, global event, because of our own bad actions. Not to mention, it's not just about what happens in America. It's about what America is doing all across the world. So we can sit here and say, technically we have rights in the United States of America, but what does it mean if we're toppling regimes, acting in ways that are creating slave prisons in Libya and destroying the civil rights of people all around the world, to sit back, cross our arms and say, oh, we're innocent because technically we have, a Chelsea in Manhattan,
But we let little girls learn how to read, and we don't jail homosexuals. So there are some improvements we have over these countries that could be hosting.
Which means what in the context of this conversation?
Well, I mean, that's what we're getting into a moral relativism here.
No, we're not. And I had this conversation actually recently on my podcast with Coleman Hughes. And we were kind of have this philosophical conversation about what it means that it's such a common rhetorical device, I'm sorry, that conservatives use that say, well, this is better than that. It is better today than it was 60 years ago for Black people. Like what those kind of arguments do is often derail more substantive conversations about how things could be improved and what is still wrong today. So there's no problem with admitting that there's been improvement for, let's say, Black Americans in the States. There's no problem in admitting that there are many, many respects in which the civil rights and living standards of people in the United States, including for women in the United States, is better than the people of Qatar. That does not absolve the United States of responsibility and accountability for our actions, many of which are invisible because we have a media class that doesn't cover what goes on in the rest of the world. And those of us like ourselves who are very aware of the negative effects of American imperialism, I think should be cautious about why the media is choosing to draw contrast between Qatar and the United States at the same time that we're happy to avail ourselves of the resources and the events that are happening in Qatar, and at the same time that there is little to no criticism of the way that America enables despotic regimes all over the world as long as they
I don't think
support
we have to
us
make
economically.
Excuses for Qatar because America just had a ruling on abortion that a lot of people
Is it making excuses for Qatar? Did I make excuses for Qatar?
No, I think that media clip, I think he did, yeah.
He made excuses for Qatar?
It was pivoted, what about it? Well, maybe that's bad, but...
Oh, I didn't hear it that way. And I do think that I'd have to go back and re-listen, but I think that there's a legitimate criticism, a legitimate scrutiny that should be given to why it is that the U.S. suddenly has an appetite to cover this, when ordinarily it doesn't. And it is
what do you mean it doesn't have the ability to, the apparent right to declare political messages during sports games, like that's a huge topic we've been discussing here.
It ordinarily ignores the kind of inequities that we see all over the world, including when it is politically convenient to do so. So, for example, in Israel, for example, in Saudi Arabia, and for example, our allies. So one of the things that Hillary Clinton said in this interview, or maybe it was Condoleezza Rice, I can't remember which now, was that, democracies don't invade other countries, trying to make the distinction between, when America intervenes and when it doesn't. Mm-hmm. And I think it was Kyle Kalinske who pointed out that America financially supports and is allies with something like 70-odd despotic regimes all across the world. And so it really isn't about whenever there's these articulations of principle, over and over again, we see that it's not actually about principle. The principles are real and they exist in the abstract. They exist outside of the world of politics. But when these politicians, when these warmongers, when the state and when the media class, which is very much tethered with the state, makes these kind of criticisms, it's often not because of the general principle. It's because they're advancing some kind of political practice. And that's not the individuals on the ground, not LGBT people who are individually concerned with this. But I do think it's worth bringing some scrutiny to why certain people are making these criticisms at this time. That's all. I think it's a perfectly fine thing to analyze.
All right, well, tomorrow on Rising, we'll continue to get you updates on all the latest stories. There's some specificity for you.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts, and we're available on Roku and other streaming services.
See you later.
All right, bye-bye.